This came out in 2018,
Yes,
and it's been on the bestseller list ever since then.
it has, yes.
This book is intended for us, for white progressives. I believe that white progressives cause the most daily damage to people of color.
I told my fellow white participants that if they felt moved to tears, they should please leave the room. I would go with them for support, but I asked that they not cry in the mixed group. After the discussion, I spent the next hour explaining to a very outraged white woman why she was asked to not cry in the presence of people of colour. You know, I read this, and instantly in my head, all I heard was,
デートに来る
Hello and welcome back to the laytonicles channel! I am he, I am the Layton in question, and today you are joining me in the midst of my mini-series documenting my thoughts and feelings in relation to Robin Diangelo's White Fragility, the cultural phenomenon that has swept the nation and, in my doing my research, has seemingly been sweeping the nation for a whole 2 years, because as of recording this, it has been on the New York Times bestseller list for over 110 weeks, and it's currently sat still at number 2. Crazy. I was making my annotations as I went along, bolstered by my far less life-enhancing master's degree than advertised. So hopefully we'll run into some 200 IQ thoughts, my dudes, but who knows? There was quite a lot of discourse surrounding this text, but I tried my best to stay clear of it because I didn't want you to just have a conglomeration of other people's thoughts and feelings. What I'm saying is I went into this book raw. Oh, that's gross. But you get my point. I value my authenticity and my integrity. I'm trying to give you my thoughts and feelings and not some, this is the correct thing to say, bloop, bloop. The last episode, if you haven't seen it, the format went such that it was the Hot Ones formula. We started off with the little baby spice, a little in terms of the points that I made in relation to the book, and then we moved up gradually, and I suppose loosely this will follow a similar-ish format, although now that I have finished the book, I'll be a bit more conclusive, I suppose. So basically, the first couple of points, though they are very spicy, they're important, I think, to understanding the text as a whole, which is why I'm starting with them. This is quite a mixed bag of a book, but you know, come along with me for the journey. Bars. I'm cringe. I think that's it in terms of prerequisites. That's all you need to know going forward, I think. So now we will strap in and strap on for the rest of Robin Diangelo's White Fragility.
デートに来る
First stop on the White Fragility train is a point that I have written out as race essentialism. Let's jump in. Splishy splashy, we're wet because we're in a pool. I don't know what I'm saying. This is the opening line to page 7. I am a white American raised in the United States. I have a white frame of reference and a white worldview, and I move through the world with a white experience. My experience is not a universal human experience. It is a particularly white experience in a society in which race matters profoundly. A society that is deeply separate and unequal by race. The part that I don't have an issue with, just quickly, is the end part with the unequal by race, because obviously we've all seen the graphs and the disparities, etc., and so on. The point that I think that is interesting, and I think the philosophy, the ideology that permeates throughout this book is this idea of having a white frame of reference, a white worldview, a white experience. Part of the issue that I have with this is that it's never characterized what makes up those components, you know, and I do somewhat suspect that it's somewhat owing to, and it's said pretty overtly, that the audience for this book is assumed to be white people, and I presume if you buy into this kind of ideology, you're going to be of the identity politics variety. So when she says white worldview, white frame of reference, the white people that I presume that she thinks are reading this, you know, the white people, though, oh yes, I know exactly what she's talking about. Essentially what I'm saying is, I think my issue is that I imagine there are some things taken for granted that are, oh, this is what it means to be white, this is what it means to have a white experience, that are abstracted out, but you could then go to a person of colour group and be like, well, hang on, the things that you're calling white, actually, we have some of those too, and, you know, vice versa. And so it speaks, I suppose, to this kind of like, this essentializing, this kind of like determinism of there is this world, there is that world, is kind of prevalent throughout the whole book, and some things are taken for granted. And one of the things that I think is taken for granted, I'll go on. This is page 37. It reads, in the US, race is encoded in geography. I can name every neighborhood in every city and its racial makeup. First of all, weird. Continuing, I can also tell if a neighborhood is coming up or down in terms of its home equity, and this will be based primarily on how its racial demographics are changing. Going up, it will be getting whiter. Coming down, it will be getting less white. Consider how we talk about white neighborhoods. Good, safe, sheltered, clean, desirable. By definition, other spaces, not white, are bad, dangerous, crime-ridden, and to be avoided. These neighborhoods are not positioned as sheltered and innocent. In these ways, the white racial framework is under construction. Now, this would make complete sense if black or person of colour was not being used synonymously with being poor.
There ain't even that many black people in the country, okay? Black people are 10% of the fucking population. The whole rest of the country, the other 40 states, is filled up with broke-ass white people.
Reading this and throughout other points of the book, it kind of a lot of it reminded me of that Biden quote that came out like a year ago, where he's talking about how
we have this notion that somehow if you're poor, you cannot do it. Poor kids are just as bright and just as talented as white kids.
There was kind of like a Freudian slip, or like this kind of like mask off of, oh, when we say black, what we're saying basically is poor, you know? These things are kind of being used interchangeably, I think, anyway. And it doesn't really speak to the differences within the umbrella of black, and then broader still, the umbrella of person of colour, because, again, as I mentioned the last episode, person of colour is so obfuscating that it almost bears no analytical usage, shall we say, like in terms of the data points you can draw out, because the groups within it are so different. And of course they would be, because the only reason for coalition is simply not being white. Again, to use the analogy that I used in the first episode, it would be as though it was like, oh, you can be under the category of blue, or you can be under the category of every colour that's not blue. Obfuscation.
For example, the average white American household of Russian descent earns $1 for every 79 cents earned by the average white American household of French descent. In America, both of these groups would just be called white people. But if you categorize them by the country in Europe they came from, you get a 21 cent on the dollar pay gap. And this is equally true if you break down quote-unquote black people into subgroups and sub-ethnicities. You'll find that Nigerian households make not only more than the average American household, but much more than the average, say, Haitian American household. Yet both of these people are black.
I do think there is a historical, race-based explanation for why some of the disparities exist in America. Like, I swear a few months ago, John Lewis died, and there was a clip of him telling a story of how when he was younger, he literally wasn't allowed to go to the library because black. So, of course, you can imagine how, you know, that would be an instant cut off to education, for instance. You know, maybe some of you watching, you perhaps even have grandparents that grew up in a completely different society because of, you know, pre-civil rights era stuff, slavery, Jim Crow laws, redlining, so on and so forth. Of course, that would have a knock-on effect, which I think makes a distinction in terms of like some of the class breakdowns that happen. Because again, I think often when we do talk about black issues, we're talking about issues that more so affect the lower class, the working class. And, you know, in me doing research, I did specifically find a clip where Robin is pitched that question specifically of like, well, what about class? And then her response is,
you cannot talk about any other issue without talking about how race informs that issue. And when someone says it's about class, that tends to function as a way to get race off the table.
Whereas I'm saying the exact opposite, in fact. I'm saying, let's talk about race, but in all its multiplicity, because when you break down a lot of the races that constitute themselves as white, black. There is so much variation within them, it makes more sense to actually do a correct factor analysis, so to speak, so you can actually point what some of the variables are, as opposed to this very obfuscating, oh, it's because black, oh, it's because white. Again, there will be prejudices and biases that perhaps persons of colour, people of colour face, that perhaps the whites TM won't, but generally speaking, the things that will elevate all of the groups are the same thing. Housing, education, employment possibilities, so on and so forth.
I grew up in my neighborhood. We didn't have a lot of diversity in my neighborhood. Diversity is always people's talking about it. And we didn't have it. You know, my neighborhood was poor black, poor white. That was our neighborhood, you know. So I didn't feel any white privilege. I know some people had it, man, you know. I knew some motherfuckers with sweaters. But I was 2 tank tops in the winter, okay?
Following this, on page 136, I should have put glasses on, she writes, white men occupy the highest positions in the race and gender hierarchy, thus they have the power to define their own reality and that of others. Whiteness within like texts like these and some of the discourse online is literally written about as though it's like a superpower. Like, I swear, like 2 weeks ago or so, at this point, I saw a tweet that was talking about how, like, if you see a white homeless man, you should never give money to them, because the idea was like, oh, if you fumble the bag that hard, as though the idea is that, like, life is just like paved out for you, like you have no ills or quarrels. I don't know if this is the case overseas, like in America, for instance. UK working class white boys now are actually considered a minority in universities. Did people know that? Who knows? And then in America, of course, a lot of the drug overdoses and drug addictions, not to mention workplace fatalities and suicides, are vastly overrepresented by white men. So again, it's this thing of the apex fallacy of like, well, just because some of the top people are white men is not to say that the entire structure is also white men. I think a lot of the issues that we say that are race issues, a lot of them are class-based, and I think they have class-based solutions. But talking about class is nowhere near as sexy and seductive as talking about race, so, you know, will there be upper-class fragility? Will there be middle-class fragility? I doubt it.
But I didn't have it, man. It was just poor black kids, poor white kids, man. And my poor black friends would always be like, man, look what you did to us. And I'm like, dude, do you think I would do all that shit to y'all and then move right next door, bro? Now, we gonna split this plum or not, dog? We're in this together, man.
What a big point that was, but we got through it in the end. Next point that I would like to talk about is one that I suspect that if other people have read this text, that this is probably more of an obvious critique of it, if you would even consider it a critique. Maybe you won't. But I've put it under the heading of projection. This is page 82. Had I been old enough, I probably would have marched in the 1960s, and yet as far as into the 1990s, I was saying and doing racially problematic things. Although I do them less often and less blatantly today, I still do them. And I read that and I was like, interesting. Mommy Diangelo, please tell us more. The fireplace was on. I've cozied up to her leg and I was like, oh, tell us more. Tell us more, Mommy Diangelo. But then I remembered I had the surprise emote from Animal Crossing, bro. And I was like, oh wait, on page 53, she relays a story of how she was invited to a public space to enjoy a white barbecue with a colleague, which you already know that food's not being seasoned, bro. I'll just read the quote before I continue making very stereotypical jokes. I'm just saying there's more to life than salt and pepper, you know what I mean? Page 53, it reads, for example, I was invited to the retirement party of a white friend. The party was a potluck held in a public park. As I walked down the slope toward the picnic shelters, I noticed 2 parties were going on side by side. One gathering was primarily composed of white people, and the other appeared to be all black people. I experienced a sense of disequilibrium as I approached and had to choose which party was my friend's. I don't understand how this happened. She has a white friend there's a white party going on, there's a black party going on. Seemingly she's quite distinct in her. How is she like almost wandering into the black, whatever. I experienced a sense of disequilibrium. As I approached, I had to choose which party was my friend's. I felt a mild sense of anxiety. I considered that I might have to enter the other group. This relief was amplified as I thought that I might have mistakenly walked over to the black party! How do you mistakenly walk over to an entirely different barbecue? Bitch, you on some fucking bullshit, bro. All these thoughts and feelings happened in just a few seconds, but they were a rare moment of self-awareness, and the mere possibility that I might have to experience not belonging racially was enough to raise racial discomfort. So this, to me, would be what I would actually characterize as, I was about to call it traditional racism. I would just call it racism proper, which is, you know, having adverse thoughts and feelings about a group off rip. Prejudice, race-based prejudice, essentially. And, you know, obviously she's relaying this to us as a way of kind of like, I'm not like that anymore. Not necessarily that I'm not like that anymore. It's just this kind of like affirmative of, hey, fellow whites, I too, perhaps, am like this. Though with that being said, I don't know if this is the guttural response that all whites TM feel, you know, this kind of like anxiety at the possibility of being around black people. I think this might be a her thing, and that's why I have this under the spectrum of projection. And conversely, I would hope that she doesn't assume that this is how all black people feel in white spaces, so to speak. There's this kind of like uneasiness of being the racial other. But who knows? Continuing, page 90, it reads, I remind readers that I'm addressing white people at the societal level. I have friends who are black and whom I love deeply. I do not have to suppress feelings of hatred and contempt as I sit with them. Well, that's good. I see their humanity, but on the macro level, I also recognize the deep anti-black feelings that have been inculcated in me since childhood. These feelings surface immediately, in fact, before I can even think, when I conceptualize black people in general. Again, this is actual racism. Robin, it's okay. This reminded me of like, I don't know, if you're in some form of like abusive relationship, but except it's kind of like flipped and it's like, you know what? I might be racist, but I'm only racist because everybody else is racist. It's like, no, you're just racist. Bro, what are we talking about? You know what I mean? This is part of my issue with like social constructionism, this idea that like we live in a society and therefore that's why it's like, dude, it's not as like predetermined as I think it's being made out to be. This kind of like, well, I grew up in this setting and this and that and the other. How else could I think? It's like, dude, you're like 60 something, bro. You've had fucking time, bro. You know what I mean? Is this just a manifestation of white guilt through and through? Who knows? I'm being a bit crass, a bit facetious. I don't think it's entirely that. She's obviously put a lot of time and effort into the theorization behind this. It's not all a defense to her white guilt, so to speak, but I do think that it's a key component, and I would be remiss to have not mentioned it to you, dear viewer.
Stop fucking playing with me, nigga. I'll air that shit out, nigga.
This next point is one that I have put down as White Women's Tears, and I think that's probably just because the chapter is called White Women's Tears. This one was spooky to me. I'll read it to you, and maybe you'll feel the internal spook also, and then we'll elaborate, we'll go through it together. Page 131, it reads, she's telling an anecdote. When another police shooting of an unarmed black man occurred, my workplace called for an informal lunch gathering of people who wanted to connect and find support. Just before the gathering, a woman of colour pulled me aside and told me that she wanted to attend, but she was in no mood for White Women's Tears today. I assured her that I would handle it. As the meeting started, I told my fellow white participants... Hello, my fellow white participants. Oh my fucking god, bro. I told my fellow white participants that if they felt moved to tears, they should please leave the room. I would go with them for support, but I asked that they not cry in the mixed group. After the discussion, I spent the next hour explaining to a very outraged white woman why she was asked to not cry in the presence of people of colour. You know, I read this, and instantly in my head, all I heard was
Nightmare, 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 nightmare.
You can't do that.
Again, like, part of my concern is because, like, the audience for this text is so insular. It's like uppity white people. So if the idea that they're coming away from this, that it's like, oh, maybe we shouldn't cry in mixed group settings, the idea that, like, that shouldn't be expressed, or you should absent yourself, as though that's the right thing to do. I don't know. I'm just like, ID Paul is so, like, bizarre in that, like, I could imagine, let's say, a century ago, the idea of a white person crying at the peril, crying at, like, a black tragedy, so to speak. I would almost imagine actual, like, white supremacist types would be like, oh, why are you crying? Or like, oh, you shouldn't be crying. Whereas now we're in a place where it's like, you still shouldn't cry, but because it's progressive, oh, it's progressive not to cry, or it's progressive for you to take yourself off. I don't know, dude. There's something very 4D chess and, like, Byzantine about this. On 132, still talking about this mixed group saying, white women don't cry, etc. This is how the sentence starts. It reads, many of us see emotions as naturally occurring, but emotions are political in two key ways. And I'm just like, dude, if you're conceptualizing crying like this, you fumbled the bag, bro. Like, you're, like, off on some other bullshit. I'm not saying that there can't potentially be a point to this, but I just think just because you can look at something from a particular lens or perspective is not to say that it's the best one or the most constructive to do so, let's say. So to be like, well, actually, your crying is political. Crying is political now. I'm just like, it's too much, dude. ID Paul has gone too far. It's gross. Since many of us have not learned how racism works and our role in it, our tears may come from shock and stress about what we don't know or recognize. For people of color, our tears demonstrate our racial insulation and privilege. I'm so fucking blown back that this is the book to be, like, the key book in how people are talking about issues like this. As people of color, I implore my white brethren, in the event that you want to do so, dude, cry. You don't need to, like, go off and, like, conceal yourself and, oh, I'll just cry by myself or in an all-white set. We're bringing segregation back, bro. We're really bringing segregation back. That's what we're doing. I should add a caveat. I did write this point in as, like, I had a plus and a minus with it, because it was a bit of a mixed bag. She does give an example of how I can somewhat get on board with this kind of thing. The idea that, like, in some ways, white women tears can be bad. And the example that she gives is talking about the story of Emmett Till, which, if you don't know, was a young black boy that supposedly was flirting with a white woman. White woman snitched. And then Emmett Till was kidnapped from his place of residence, beaten, killed, etc. And then this woman, after all this time, on her deathbed, mind you, so she didn't have to pay any of the consequences, she was like, oh lol JK, I actually lied, that didn't happen. So I suppose I'll just read the cap off. It reads, the murder of Emmett Till is just one example of the history that informs an oft-repeated warning from my African-American colleagues. When a white woman cries, a black man gets hurt. I'm going to start using that in arguments against all the women that you're a fucking bitch. They start crying, wow, white women's tears, really? As a black man? Ugh, hate to see it. I'm being facetious. I'm being a bit jovial. Well, continuing on with the rest of the quote, it reads, because of its seeming innocence, well-meaning white women crying in cross-racial interactions is one of the more pernicious enactments of white fragility. Oh my god! Oh, dude, this book's a fucking trip, bro. It's fucking wild. There are quite a few instances in this book where it's like, it gives an example of, oh, okay, that makes sense, but then it's like conflated or kind of like hyperbolized to the most extreme degree, and I think this is an example of that, of like, oh, okay, is nothing sacred? Is everything destined to be within the matrix of ID Paul? We can't come together and share in the pain and sorrow of our common humanity. What's going on, bro? It's too much, you know what I mean? Nobody hates white women like white women, and that's
That's no good.
So the previous point was a bit of a mixed bag. Now we're going a bit more into the positive section, if you could call it that, or the point where I was like, okay, that makes sense, or to some facet it makes sense. So this is under the heading of racial belonging. This is page 52 currently. It reads, as I move through daily life, my race is unremarkable. I belong when I turn on TV, read best-selling novels, and watch blockbuster movies. I belong when I walk past the magazine racks at the grocery store or drive past billboards, for example. And then there's a bit of a skip, and it gets to the grander point that I'm getting to, which is, for example, in 2017, since Rihanna introduced a makeup line for women of all skin colours, gratitude from women of colour poured in. Many of their tweets included the exclamation, finally. These are tweets that I have never needed. And so I suppose this point is owing to, you know, that there are issues that perhaps people of colour face or have faced that white people simply would not be subjected to. And the makeup one being a prime example of that. Inclusivity, etc. You have a country of a population, you should be able to see to the needs of that population, especially if you fucking hold a bunch of them from a fucking country, a continent that they didn't even fucking ask to be, pussy. And then on page 56, it reads, another way that my life has been shaped by being white is that my race is held up as the norm for humanity. Whites are just people. Our race is rarely ever mentioned. Think about how often white people mention the race of a person if they are not white. My black friend, the Asian woman, etc. I think there's something to this, though I'm not necessarily sure how much of this is entirely prevalent to all of the countries she purports to be writing about or for. I think it makes most sense for America, for instance, and I'll get into why in a second, but I don't think it makes sense for the characterizations of like Western countries, and by name, you know, she mentions like Australia, the UK. And maybe what I'm about to say is more of a semantics thing, and who knows how much relevance this has to, you know, the minutiae of daily life and things like that. But I do think there is something to the way that, I suppose, Americans, don't come at me, Americans characterize their population, so to speak. So, for instance, their black people are African, American, Asians, Asian, American, so on and so forth. But then when you get to white people, there's not Anglo-American or European-American, which, you know, if you were doing it for everyone, that would probably make the most sense. And then conversely, even the people you would consider to just be American, so what we call the Native Americans, they're called Native American. Is there anything? Is this anything? Is there something about having, I suppose, like a prefix or like a descriptor, an adjective beforehand? For comparison, in Britain, it's somewhat different. Like, I'm not considered Caribbean British or African British. I'm just British. I don't know if it's just like, oh, that's just the subtlety of Britain, but it's actually just as racist, bro. Who knows? But unless like race is pertinent, as far as I think anyway, I don't think it's really said in that way. Like, it's not, oh, this is my African American friend or whatever. Who is introducing people like that to begin with? But you get my point. I would just be considered British until, for whatever reason, race is pertinent to the conversation. But again, like within America, seemingly it always is. Insofar as identifying people, again, African American, Asian American, it's like, well, you're all Americans, and that's part of the thing. Like, everyone can be American, but no, not everyone can just be American by itself unless it's white people. Is this anything? I thought it was at least food for thought. I don't know how much credence or relevance it has within the broader topic of racism, so to speak, but I think there's probably something. And, you know, credit where credit's due. We're not trying to do partisan hackery, etc., 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 things, blah, blah. The part of this that I do have somewhat of a gripe with, you know, under this umbrella of the idea of racial belonging, there's a point on page 59 that reads, as a white person, I can openly and unbiasedly reminisce about the good old days, romanticized collections of white privilege which manifests itself in the ability to remain oblivious to our racial history. I think the key word within this is romanticized, because I feel like, yeah, okay, every group of friends has probably done the thing of, oh, if you could go to any point in time, which point of time would you go to, for instance? And, you know, every black person, probably me especially, has made the joke of, oh, if I were to go back in time, I would probably just get lynched, ha ha ha, very funny, slavery. But then the idea that like it has just been like a cakewalk for white people, again, this is the thing with like the apex fallacy thing, because for the longest time living in society, because we live in a society, was awful for everyone that wasn't like at the upper echelon of society. In some ways, there are parallels to the common day. Not as awful, obviously, but you get my point. You know, if you weren't, I don't know, a part of the monarchy, your family wasn't powerful, things of that nature, like you were just in fucking poverty all the time. So this idea that like, well, history's been great for has been great for the whites always, is just not true. I think serfs were like slaves that you bought with land, and they were white people, and that was happening through to the 19th and perhaps 20th century. Slavery is not just a black phenomenon. Slavery is going on right now. Oh, and also slavery is not specifically just, oh, the whites took us. No one talks about the Arabs taking the blacks either, but that's not as it's not as sexy. Anyway, again, this speaks to the apex fallacy thing again of like, oh, if you were white, you just had it set. It's like, no, everyone was in poverty unless you were at the top. People died of very curable diseases. Child mortality was so high, you'd fucking try and have like 15 kids just in the hopes that one of them survived and made it to 30. Like, most of human history has been a bloodbath. It's been awful for borderline everyone. There's a graph that will hopefully try to insert, and it's basically everyone was dirt fucking poor until very recent times. So again, I think the key word in here is romanticized, because if you were anyone that went back in time, you're probably dying of like syphilis. You're dying of like a very curable disease. It's awful. It was awful. It was awful for everyone. One of the biggest issues that I have with this ideology, this form of theorization, is that it builds itself to be infallible, by which I mean it is never wrong. There is no parameter by which it sets itself to be like, oh, okay, maybe this is wrong here. There's always kind of like these ad hoc hypotheses to be like, oh, that's racist, well, this isn't right, oh, that's racist. Racism is always the answer. So for instance, on page 145, it reads, white identity is inherently racist. White people do not exist outside the system of white supremacy. And I'm like, dude, it's reading shit like that makes me so happy that I wasn't born white, because like, y'all niggas in a fucking minefield, bro. There's somewhat of a weird part that I came across in this racism is always the answer. I'm being a bit facetious, kind of, in the point that I'm about to make, but let me read the quote to you and then I'll make it. On page 149, unlike heavy feelings such as guilt, the continuous work of identifying my internalized superiority, it's always internalized. It's so strange to me. My internalized superiority and how it may be manifesting itself is incredibly liberating. That sounds kind of hot. When I start from the premise that of course I have been thoroughly socialized into the racist culture in which I was born, I no longer need to expend energy denying that fact. I am eager, even excited, to identify my inevitable collusion so that I can figure out how to stop colluding! Denial and defensiveness that is needed to maintain it is exhausting. A little bit of this reads to me that this is a bit of a kink.
Is that a kink? Do I have a new kink?
She gets excited by being called out for being racist. That's a little bit sus. That's a bit ooh-woo daddy, call me racist. Oh, you dirty racist little... I don't know, dude. It's a bit strange to me. Page 129. I repeat, stopping racist patterns must be more important than working to convince others that we don't have them. We do have them, and people of colour already know we have them. Our efforts to prove otherwise are not convincing. Don't speak for me, bro. As people of colour, I don't assume that all people have these races, but maybe you do with your motherfucking, I don't want to go to the black barbecue, I feel anxiety about that. Maybe you do, but to put that on everyone else, broski, I'm not with it, you know what I mean?
Speak for yourself, motherfucker!
This final point, I suppose, is just a bit of a conglomeration of various things. The heading is simply, I don't think I could be friends with these people. There's something to being equal to another person, that if at the drop of a hat, under ideas found in this book, I can just like, I can make somebody a subordinate, and they don't have a say in it. I don't know, dude. There's a point where she's talking about cross-racial friendships. And again, it's so kind of like Byzantine and distorted, and just like, this is not the correct lens for analysis, I think. Page 80, it reads, yet cross-racial friendships do not block out the dynamics of racism in a society at large, and these dynamics continue unabated. The white person will receive white privilege that a friend of color does not, even when the two people are in activities together. Nor do these friendships block out all the messages that we have internalized that are reinforced in the society. In fact, racism invariably manifests itself within cross-racial friendships as well. Racism cannot be absent from your friendship. No person of color whom I've met has said that racism isn't at play in his or her friendship with white people. Some whites are more thoughtful, aware, and receptive to feedback than others, but no cross-racial relationship is free from the dynamics of racism in this society. If racism is not a topic of discussion between a white person and a person of color who are friends, this absence of conversation may indicate a lack of cross-racial trust. This bitch really said, talk about racism or else. I don't think I can be friends with, like, uppity woke white people in this way, dude. Like, I just can't. It's too much fucking work, bro. It's so Byzantine. Like, dude, I don't want to fucking sit and talk about fucking race all the time, bitch. And again, like, because this is such an, like, the book is supposed to be for such an insular, woke white audience, this idea, I would so not be happy about the idea that, like, the woke whites are reading this, being like, oh, I have some black friends, and they haven't spoken to me about racism, so that must mean that they think I'm racist. It's like, dude, or maybe you just have, like, a functioning relationship that isn't necessitated by you talking about racism. Is that a possibility under the guise of this kind of stuff? It's not. I don't know what she wants from the point of this book. I don't know what would constitute for her a diminishment of racism. On page 50, it reads, I'm often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than concrete rules such as Jim Crow. I don't think it's a good idea to have your income be incumbent on the thing that you're claiming to be fighting against, so to speak, because to a certain degree, you almost don't want that thing to end, because it's like, well, you've invested your entire life and resources and time into this thing. So there is, like, an incentive to keeping it going, so to speak. And frequently on the internet, grifter has become a word that gets thrown around like fucking confetti, seemingly. It's like, oh, I don't like their belief system. They probably don't believe it themselves. They're a grifter. I do think that she thinks this way. In these terms, but I also don't think it's a good idea to, as I say, like, combined income with ideology, because you kind of, like, you need that, you in some ways you need to perpetuate that belief structure, because, like, otherwise, like, she gets paid like tens of thousands of pounds to run seminars and things like this, and she says this kind of off rip, you know, that she's somewhat incentivized, because on page 2, which for all intents and purposes, the beginning of the book, full circle, it reads, I have a rare job. On a daily basis, I lead primarily white audiences in discussions of race, something many of us avoid at all costs. And it's like, part of the reason why you don't avoid it at all costs is because it's lucrative for you. Like, what's one of the quotes in here? There it is. I'm often asked if I think the younger generation is less racist. No, I don't. In some ways, racism's adaptations over time are more sinister than the concrete rules such as Jim Crow. I just think that that's so absurd, and it's so kind of, like, determinist and cynical, and it's like, oh, they're not actually less racist, they're just performing racism less. I'm like, what is actually, what do you want? From the jump, it's clear that the point of this book isn't actually to diminish racism, because on page 5 it reads, this book does not attempt to provide the solution to racism, which obviously, like, it's fine, fair enough, you probably can't do that in a singular book, but I'm also like, to an extent, put your fucking money where your mouth is, you know? If this is one of the most pressing issues of our time, at least, like, attempt. Otherwise, this just comes across as, like, self-flagellation for, like, uppity white people, which, of course, got fucking shmoney, bro. You think, like, working-class people have time to sit around reading White Fragility and learn about how privileged they are? No. To one of the beginning points that I made, this kind of, race determinism, this white worldview, white experience, white outlook, so on and so forth. I feel like the premise of this book somewhat collapses under its own ideology because she purports this kind of white worldview, white experience, white outlook, so on and so forth. What do I, a person of colour, I'm in the person of colour world, I have a person of colour experience, person of colour outlook, whatever those things entail, whatever that conglomeration entails, that uniformity, that hegemony entails, what incentive do I have to even listen to her? We don't inhabit the same world. I'm being rhetorical with this. I don't actually believe that, but I'm saying, like, if I actually believed some of the ideas in this book, that presumably is the conclusion that I would come to, of like, well, we're in different worlds, they don't intersect, never do the oceans intersect, what could I possibly learn from you? And the answer to that question was absolutely nothing. Just kidding. Some closing bits before I disappear and smack you on the bum and go on now, little scamp. That's I feel like I was running out of steam a little bit coming to the end of the previous film session, so I thought I'd run it back, hopefully with a bit more energy. So, the first question I hear you ask is, am I glad that I read White Fragility? And the answer to that is yes. Because rather than just kind of like hearsay of what and how things are being discussed in spaces such as these, like sociological things, I got like a first-hand, like it's the most popular representation of the theorization and beliefs of this school of thought, critical race theory. Because sometimes if you're online, maybe you'll come across a person that's like, well, people don't actually think that, or people don't actually say that. And I'm kind of like, well, not only do they actually say that, it's actually the most popular representation of that belief structure, theorization. Yeah, glad that I read it, although I don't think I learned a whole bunch. It's just good to have it pressed to my face and analysed for you. On the fun topic of white supremacy, I did think about, like, whatever the we live in society for this is, how you can openly come out as a racist person, and not only do people not dismiss you, but they openly pat you on the back and you become a millionaire. Because as I said in the beginning, this is incredibly well selling. She's doing talks for tens of thousands of dollars. White guilt is like coal. We probably shouldn't use it anymore, but it's incredibly resourceful. And then on the topic of critical race theory, which, as I say, like, is the school that underpins the theorization of this stuff, it's all the people of colour oppressed, white people oppressors. This is in perpetuity. And so I don't think I'm alone in feeling, being a person of colour, that I don't like this stuff and I don't feel like it represents my thoughts and beliefs on this. It just feels like it's making things worse. And I get that there are issues that we have, and so generally speaking, you know, it's better to do something than nothing. But if the something is this, bro, get it the fuck out of here. To think that hundreds of thousands of people have read this in like an insular pocket and being like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Or, oh, I guess that is the... I'm just like, it blows my fucking mind, bro. And the idea that, like, this is being rolled out to schools, more so in the Americas, although you may have heard it was even being discussed in UK Parliament, because again, activist type people were, oh, we should teach the children about white privilege and white supremacy. It's like, bro, little Timmy's like fucking 6 years old, bro. Niggas just trying to swap some Pokemon cards, bro. Play some Smash Brothers. I'm just talking about myself at this point. Am I little Timmy? I might be little Timmy, bro.
And I want to speak about a dangerous trend in race relations that has come far too close to home to my life, and it is the promotion of critical race theory, an ideology that sees my blackness as victimhood and their whiteness as oppression.
Given that you've made it this far, thanks for being interested and caring what I have to say, because I really care about this a lot. This issue, I guess, even though it's not usually my bag of tricks, but this was important to me. And the video that you have just watched was actually my third attempt filming the thing, and that was 2 hours cut down to about 40, and the episode that I did before this one, that took about 7 or 8 attempts. So basically what I'm saying is I really care, I'm really trying. Hopefully I conveyed my thoughts, feelings, analysis as best I can for you, dear listener. I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you perhaps contemplated a point of view that you perhaps hadn't before, or if not, you know, I just hope you had fun along the way. I hope you laughed at points, hopefully, because again, this is primarily a comedy channel. And on that, I suppose I should mention where the channel is going, because this has been the theme, because it has been somewhat of a mini-series. Comedy, still. This stuff interests me, so I think I will dabble from time to time in sociological things. But I think primarily it will be like comedy. So, you know, if you've joined me this far, you might as well continue joining me. If you haven't subscribed, subscribe. If you haven't hit the bell, hit the bell. Drop a like, because apparently that helps. Yeah. Thanks for coming along with me and trusting me with this. If you haven't seen the previous episode, watch that, because I discuss different things. I think it's interesting. I still do think it's quite a bit of a banger. So watch that. That'll be on the end card coming up. Okay, so now I think that's actually it. I think that's it. As I say, thanks for joining me. I know it was a long video. Thanks for joining me on this. So, as always, thanks for hanging out with me. I had fun hanging out with you. Parasocial relationship game 100.
デートに来る